I'm very pleased to introduce and thank John Hibbing for being with us today to speak on polarization and the 2024 election. And I also want to welcome his wife Ann with us here. And I also want to thank John for being one of the great members on the ERA program committee. He does a fabulous job. I'm very honored to introduce John today, who is the Emeritus Foundation Regents University Professor of Political Science at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he taught for 42 years before retiring last year. His research focus was the influence of genetics and biology on people's political orientations, and he was named a NATO Fellow in Science, a Senior Fulbright Fellow, an elected Fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science, and in 2016, he was also selected as a Guggenheim Fellow. So he's a fellow in a lot of organizations. He's been featured on Star Talk with Neil deGrasse Tyson, NPR's The Hidden Brain, and this is the best one, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Now, that is the champ. What a fun experience. His most recent book is The Securitarian Personality, What Really Motivates Trump's Base and Why It Matters in the Post-Trump Era. I think you can see that all of John's accomplishments and honors reflect how highly he is regarded and respected in Nebraska, in the United States, and throughout the world. And he remains, what I find so amazing about John is how incredibly humble he is. I knew nothing about any of this before that. So that is a real gift. We're very fortunate that he is with us today. So please help me in welcoming John here.
Thank you, Pam. It's very nice. Pleasure to be with you, although it's a bit of a challenging assignment. The election season has been going on forever, it seems like. And so much has been said and written already. Plus, this is obviously a very educated and informed, knowledgeable bunch. So I'm just not sure there's that much I can tell you that we don't already know. On top of that, I know from experience that it's pretty much impossible to talk for 45 minutes about modern American politics without antagonizing somebody. So I guess as you listen to me today, I would just ask one thing. Remember that I come in peace. So I thought what I'd do today is answer some questions that I am commonly asked. So I loved being a political science professor. I loved everything about it. But there is an occupational hazard, and that is that people will sidle up to you at social events, extended family gatherings, and ask questions about politics. So I thought maybe the questions that I was most frequently getting this season would be some of the same questions that would be popping around in your heads. So it's not going to be an extremely smooth talk. I'm going to jump from topic to topic a little bit, but hopefully, even though a lot of you will know pretty much everything about some of these topics, maybe there'll be one or two here or there that I can actually shed some light on for you. So what are these questions? So question number one. What happens if a nominee is incapacitated or worse? Number two, why so much early voting? Is it secure? A lot of questions about early voting. Why do swing states get so much attention? What if no candidate receives a majority of the electoral college votes? What about the polls? Are they useful? Why do they seem to be so inaccurate? I was encouraged to talk about polarization, so we'll touch on that. Why are we so polarized now? And is our democracy in danger? Those are the questions that I thought I'd focus on. If those are not the questions that you would like to have answered, then I guess you should have made a bigger effort to be at the same cocktail parties as I go to. All right, first, just 2 or 3 minutes of background. So get ready for Political Science 100. It won't take long, but I think there is a little bit of background information I want to make sure everybody has before we launch into those individual questions. So remember, we declared our independence in 1776. We tried an experiment with something called the Articles of Confederation. This was our first governing document. Lasted about 10 years. It didn't go very well. There was really no strong central government. States were free to coin their own currency, to formulate their own foreign policy. We really didn't have a means of raising money for a army and navy, and we were under threat still by England, who didn't seem to like losing the war. So anyway, it was just kind of a mess. And so, as you know, in 1787, drafted a new constitution, the one we have now, was ratified by a sufficient number of states. So the first real election we had under our system was in 1788. George Washington won handily. The reason I'm going through all this is it's kind of interesting that in 9 of the 13 states, George Washington did not receive a single vote in 1788. And that's because we didn't have presidential elections in those states. It really wasn't necessary. So some states had an election, but it was just a beauty contest. Most states, as you can see here, did not have an election. So George Washington did not get any votes. How can that be? Well, of course, it's because of the Electoral College. Or as several students in political science class essays over the years have called it, the Electoral College. It's the Electoral College, and the founders did not have a lot of faith in the American public. They didn't think we were up to the task of selecting a president. Yet they didn't want Congress to do it. They didn't want a parliamentary system where the executive is selected by the legislature. So they created this kind of Rube Goldberg contraption that is the Electoral College. So the Constitution says that these electors will be selected by state legislatures. So there was no need to have any elections at all. The state legislatures selected the electors, and they were totally uninstructed by the people. So remember that. That's the way the founders wanted it. They wanted these electors to be completely autonomous. So the states didn't have elections at first. Then, maybe 15, 20 years in, with the rise of political parties and the people started clamoring a little bit for a greater role in the process. So we started to have a system whereby the electors were instructed by the vote of the people in each state. So we soon became kind of a state-by-state contest to see which party's slate of electors would go. That's really what the Electoral College was doing. What the presidential elections were doing on the part of the people was to see which slate of electors would go. One that was tilted toward, say, Washington or Adams or whoever it might be. Some states today, as you may know, even punish electors if they don't do what the people of the states say they should do. Do you think Nebraska does that? We actually don't. We're one of 29 states that simply says you need to vote this way. They tell the electors you vote the way the people voted. But there's no punishment. Some states have a punishment. I think there's 15 states now that have a monetary fine or perhaps even a short jail term if the elector engages in what's called faithless behavior. If the elector would go do whatever he or she wanted to do. So think of how far that's come from an autonomous system. The elector can do whatever he or she wants to a system in which the electors are totally instructed and really forced to do what the people of that state want them to do. So what we have now really is a state-by-state winner-take-all system with a couple of exceptions that we'll talk about. And also a system that does overweight small states, lightly populated states, not nearly as much as the United States Senate does, but still there's a definite bias towards smaller states. So this happens to be a ballot from Maricopa County in Arizona in 2016. I just thought I'd put it up. You probably can't read all the names, you don't need to, but notice what's there. If you voted for Trump, the Trump-Pence ticket, then what you're really doing is selecting those 11 delegates, whose names you can't probably read very well. Or if you voted for Hillary Clinton, you voted for those 11 delegates, or the Libertarian candidate, those 11, the Green Party candidate, those 11. So each party has a slate of electors, and what you're really doing when you vote in a presidential election is selecting a slate of electors. We don't, in Nebraska, as you know, we don't put the names of the electors. It would be very confusing with our system anyway, but some states still put that. So then what happens is the electors meet at their various state capitals on December 17th. That was a very important date for the founders, because remember, these guys were going to be autonomous. So this is when we knew. Now we really know after November 5th, hopefully. But then December 17th was a very important date. They met in their state capitals. Usually it's a kind of social event now because we kind of know what's happening. They have a nice dinner. They cast their votes and send them off to DC, where they will be counted in a joint session of Congress on January 6th. It's kind of interesting this year because the person who presides over that session, the joint session of Congress, is the Vice President of the United States or the President of the Senate, which will be Kamala Harris. So she'll either announce her victory or her defeat. Whichever way, it's going to be a little bit of an awkward situation for her probably. It's just a shot of the Illinois electors, because that was the one I could find. All right, so that's our background. Now we can launch into the questions. I think you'll see why we needed that little bit of a background first. The first one is a little bit uncomfortable, and certainly it's a case that this question about what happens if one of the candidates is incapacitated or worse was much more likely to be asked of me when Joe Biden was the Democratic nominee. It went down some, but nonetheless, you know, Donald Trump is 78 years old, been 2 assassination attempts. Kamala Harris is younger, but you know, it's a crazy world. You just don't know what's going to happen. So I think, you know, we need to ponder all the possibilities. What does happen if a candidate is incapacitated or worse? There are actually 3 different things that can happen depending on when the incapacitation would take place. First, the first section of time is between the conventions and election day. So anything before November 5th. In this situation, it's entirely up to the political parties. So it'd be the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee that would decide. I mean, if Kamala Harris, something would happen to her, then the DNC would make a decision. Now, presumably they'd elevate Tim Walz, but they wouldn't have to. Or the same thing on the Republican side, you know, especially right after Trump selected Vance, there was a lot of discussion, you know, that a lot of Republicans were not pleased with that. So theoretically, if something had happened to Trump, they could have gone in a different direction. And this would totally be at the discretion of the Republican National Committee. It's important to bear in mind. But no, most likely, especially if it was close to the election, they'd probably just bump up the VP. We've had this situation once, not for the president, but it was for the vice president. You remember when this was? It was pretty much in all of our lifetimes, I think. It was actually 1972, when George McGovern was the Democratic nominee, and his VP selection, Thomas Eagleton, senator from Missouri, it was revealed several weeks after the Democratic National Convention that he'd been treated for mental illness. Widespread sense that wasn't something we wanted to have in somebody a heartbeat away from the presidency. So he was moved out, and McGovern selected a guy named Sergeant Shriver to replace him. Now I say McGovern selected because he kind of did, but he had to get the DNC approval formally. That had to be done, and that's just the way we do it. The parties have a very influential role. This is a picture of the unfortunate Senator Eagleton. I want to pause just for a second here and emphasize how important political parties are in our system and what kind of role they play in our system. It really is as I say here, a kind of powerful semi-institutional legal status that they have. So, you know, there's some squawking, especially among Republicans, when Biden stepped down and the selection of his vice president, Kamala Harris, was made formal. So they said, well, this isn't a very democratic, small d way of doing things. I mean, it's never been democratic in the way we select our candidates. It's up to the party. The parties can have primaries or they don't have to have primaries. It wasn't that long ago when primaries didn't play a very big role. In 1968, Hubert Humphrey was selected to be the Democratic nominee. He won 0 primaries. There weren't any. So, you know, that's the way things were back then. That kind of instigated a switch, and the Democrats shifted things. And by 72, primaries were pretty much universal for the Democrats. It took the Republicans, ironically, a little bit longer to move toward primaries, and now we do. But the point is, it doesn't have to be that way. It's a fairly recent event, and it's certainly not something that is used worldwide. A lot of countries, this notion that to them, the idea of having an election to see who's going to be in the election is really kind of crazy. And it's just a party thing. The parties decide who their nominee is going to be, and then they run. So, you know, I think there's a little bit of hand-wringing about this whole thing, about how it has to be. We have to have primaries, and, you know, we will now because people just expect it, but it's not the way that thing works. I have to have a parenthetical comment to remind me of things I wanted to say. But I think this is a good example. Years ago, probably the late 90s, early 2000s, a couple of state legislators from Nebraska contacted me and they said, hey, we got a great idea. We're tired of Iowa getting all this attention with their First in the Nation caucus. We want to pass a law in Nebraska that says we're going to have our primary a week before Iowa. Said, will you help us? I said, no. I hope I was a little more politic than that. But I said, no, you can't do that. I said that the parties get to decide how they're going to structure their nomination process. And they said, no, you don't understand. We're going to pass a state law. I said, no, I do understand. And in this case, the party's rules they supersede a state law. You can kind of see why this would be. If we allowed states to do that, what would happen? Nebraska would move it up a week, Minnesota would move it about a week before, and you know, we'd be having primaries right after 2028 primaries right after the 2024 election. So we allow the parties to have that kind of role, and they can supersede state laws. So just bear that in mind. All right, anyway, so the parties control everything before the election. If there's somebody is incapacitated between the election and December 17th, and now you know why December 17th is important. That's a big thing for the Electoral College. Then the decision is up to the electors. So again, think back how the founders envisioned this. And they didn't think they'd get instructions anyway, so they don't care whether there's an election or not. The electors get to decide what's going on then. Now, this creates a kind of odd situation today. So these electors are instructed, so what do we do? So, think about that Arizona ballot I showed you. A slate of electors pledged to Donald Trump. Well, what if Donald Trump's no longer there? What if you're in a state where the electors get thrown in jail if they don't follow the wishes of the people? So do they have to vote for Donald Trump? Even though he's incapacitated or passed away? There's some really strange situations going on here, but presumably we'd make this work, and the second place individual, the VP, would be bumped up to the presidential role, but it would be entirely up to the electors. They could do whatever what they wanted. Would there be a challenge? Almost certainly. This would be a disaster, I think. I have no idea what the courts would do with all this, because again, the electors would be voting for a ticket that's not quite the ticket that the people voted for, because the ticket has changed. So, especially in the wake of what happened, in January 6th, 2020, there's going to be, when there wasn't a very firm basis for it. Now, there would be a basis for it. This would be a confusing situation. There'd be a lot to sort out. All right, so parties before the election, electors between the election and December 17th. After December 17th, we got it pretty well nailed, because the 25th Amendment covers this. Things would happen just about the same way they would after Inauguration Day. So we kind of view this thing as after December 17th, the decision has been made. So the vice presidential nominee would be bumped up automatically, who would become the replacement VP. Well, that's covered by the 25th Amendment. So this is a very useful thing. The president nominates somebody according to the 25th Amendment. If there's a vacancy for the vice president. Remember, the vice president is now moved up to the president, so we got to see who the VP is going to be. The president nominates a replacement, must be approved by a majority of both houses of Congress. This also has happened a couple of times in our nation's history. The first time was 1973 in Spiro Agnew. Remember all this? Now, if you're like my students, you get confused. They think it happened in 1973. It must have had to do with Watergate. No, it didn't. Spiro Agnew was in trouble because of things he did while he was governor of Maryland. He was involved in kickbacks, tax evasion. I mean, this guy made Senator Menendez of New Jersey look like a choir boy. There's a lot of things, a lot of problems. So he was removed as a result of that. And Richard Nixon then had to pick a vice president. He selected Gerald Ford. It was a wise decision because Ford was of Congress, very popular, so he was easily approved by Congress. And then, of course, Nixon himself had to resign because of Watergate. Ford moved up, and he had to pick somebody. So he selected Nelson Rockefeller. So you see Spiro Agnew on the left, the famous shot of Nixon resigning. And then a very interesting shot of Gerald Ford and Nelson Rockefeller, a situation in the country where these two individuals were not elected by the people at all. They both moved up as a result of the 25th Amendment. So this one was a little bit longer than some of the other questions. Don't panic. Political parties first, then electors, and then 25th Amendment. All right, let's get on to early voting. So some early voting is in person. Most of us don't do that way, but a lot of them can. You can go to the courthouse right now and vote. Other states make it even easier. In Texas, you have these voting centers. They might be at a shopping center, they might be at a supermarket. You can go there and cast a vote. You don't have to go to the courthouse. People love them. So that's one way to do it. Of course, more popular is voting by mail, which is now permitted in 36 states. In 17 states, you can make it permanent. Can we make it permanent in Nebraska? Not quite. So this is a tricky one because you can actually make permanent the request, right? So you automatically, a lot of you probably have done that. So every year you'll get a request for a mail-in ballot, but actually in some states you get the ballot itself automatically. 8 states have even made voting by mail the only way they do it. So you don't have an option, you have to do it, including our neighboring state of Colorado. And this is also the way it is in 13 Nebraska counties. Everybody know that we have a law in Nebraska that says if your county has 10,000 people or less, you have the option of going to all mail ballots. And county election officials love this, of course. They don't need to find officials to fan out across the county. People tend to like it as well, because these are usually sparsely populated counties where it's easier for them just to send something in. Well, as a result of the popularity of mail-in ballots and early voting, you can see how things have changed just in the course of really more than a quarter of a century. In 1996, this was something that was done by military personnel, other individuals who were overseas, maybe some college students, maybe some people who were not ambulatory, very rare. But now we've had a steady increase by in 2020, we had 46% of the people who voted before the election, either in person or probably by mail. My hunch is in 2024, we could easily be over 50%. Some people think this is a COVID deal, but as you can see, between 2016 and 2020, the increase was not really much greater than at other times. In fact, a little bit smaller than some other times. So this is a larger trend and very popular. Trump and the Republicans have had some difficulty in kind of deciding what they think of this. They were against it for a while. Trump made some very disparaging comments, but he of course voted himself by mail. And now I think the Republicans figured out that a lot of their clientele are older and would be the very ones for whom this would be a very useful kind of thing. So they've warmed to the idea. There are some advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, it's convenient. It really doesn't boost turnout. This is a widespread misconception, and one would think that this would be the case, but the evidence from political science, at least, shows very little increase in turnout as a result of mail-in voting. Most people are going to vote, and they're happy to vote in a more convenient way, but if they can't vote that way, they probably are going to vote anyway. So this just, as surprising as it may seem to some of you, there isn't much evidence that it boosts turnout. It does mean that there might be some issues with a late event. Now, you don't have to answer this question, but I think it's probably harmless. We're among friends. How many of you voted already? Yeah, okay. It's all right. Well, all of us have taken a little bit of a chance. Something could happen. Something could happen to one of the candidates. There could be some big revelation about somebody. Things happen in the last month of a campaign, but we're saying, look, we're confident enough that our vote is going to be the way it would be, regardless of what happens. That we're gonna cast the vote, but we are rolling the dice just a little bit. Obviously, there's a lot of concern about fraud with mail-in voting. Like the case with turnout, there's very little evidence that this is the case. And I think it makes sense, really. I think especially before, let's say, Nebraska adopted voter ID, I think things were tighter when you voted by mail than when you went to the polls. Really, you go to the polls, you say, "Yeah, here's my name." They say, "Do you still live here?" And I say, "Yeah." They say, "Okay, sign your name and you vote." That makes it sound like I was a big supporter of voter ID. I'm really not. But my point is, I think back then, with mail-in voting, you always had this unique barcode. That was yours. We didn't really have that with in-person voting. So I think a case could be made that mail-in voting was more secure than even in-person voting. Now with voter ID, I think, it's difficult to see how there could be massive fraud, and there really is no evidence that's the case. A lot of questions about swing states. Some people are dissatisfied with the whole situation there. Because of the way the Electoral College works, we really have 50 separate elections, but most of those elections don't matter because the state is either rock solid Republican or rock solid Democrat. This means candidates don't pay much attention to those states. There's really not much reason to. Why should they bother? As a result, we've just got a handful of states that really seem to be making all the difference. These are the states that are not in one camp or the other. They're swing states. In 2016, as I note here, Trump won Pennsylvania by just 46,000 votes on a 6 million cast. That's not a very big margin. 22,000 vote margin in Wisconsin out of 3 million, and just 10,000, less than 11,000 votes in Michigan with 5 million votes cast. It's an infinitesimally small percentage there. If Trump had lost just 2 of those states in 2016, Hillary Clinton would have been president of the United States. It was about as close in 2020. The reason I'm not putting up the numbers from 2020 is that actually Biden had a few states to spare. He won the Electoral College by a little bit more since he won Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia. But still, you had the same thing with those states really being close, and those are the ones where people spend all their time. So here you see the 7 states that are getting all the attention this year. And you can't blame the candidates for this. This is a rational thing to do. These other states are going to decide who the next president of the United States is going to be. You can imagine with a different system, if the Electoral College were assigned on a percentage basis, that within a state, we could do that. In Nebraska, Joe Biden received 39% of the vote in 2020. We could say, all right, then he's gonna get 39% of the electoral college votes from Nebraska. 39% out of 5 would round up to 2 and get 2 votes, and Donald Trump would get 3. You could do it that way. You could do it our way, which is to break it down by congressional district and then give the remaining 2 to the candidate who wins the state overall. Or you could have a national vote. You could forget state lines. It's probably not going to happen. There's too much going against it, but then we could assign it on a percentage basis. And if those situations were the case, especially the percentage votes, actually the congressional district is a tricky one. You probably wouldn't have that much more spread out interest because we only have about a couple of dozen of really competitive House districts. So instead of a state by state, you'd have kind of a district by district approach. You'd still have kind of a clustered up set of campaigns. If you had a percentage basis, though, then a vote in Nebraska would mean as much as a vote in California, and the attention that candidates would lavish on places would be very spread out. This leads to the question of what happens if no candidate gets the 270 votes that are required in the Electoral College. Seems unlikely, especially with a two-party system. As I say, yes, but not impossible. So let's make sure we got the numbers straight here. There are 538 Electoral College votes. Remember, you get each state gets the number of Electoral College votes of the representatives plus senators. 2 senators in every state. So you basically take the number of representatives in your state. We have 3 in Nebraska. Add the 2 senators, you get up to 5. So that's the way that works. So that means we have 538 Electoral College votes. We have 435 House districts, 100 senators, and then the other 3 come from where? Yeah, District of Columbia gets 3 votes. They don't have any votes in Congress. They're not represented there. Well, they have a delegate that can't vote. But they do have 3 Electoral College votes. So that brings us to 538. It's the magic number. Remember, you need to get a majority of the Electoral College. A majority is 50% plus 1. You got to get 1 more than 50%. So 50% of 538 is 269. You got to add that 1, so we're up to 270. Well, let's assume that Robert Kennedy Jr. Does not get a sufficient number of votes. Jill Stein, nobody else gets any Electoral College votes. That seems fairly safe in this day and age. Then the only way that neither Trump nor Harris can get a majority would be if it's a dead tie, 269 to 269. Odds are pretty slim with this, yes, but a lot of people are saying, as I know you know, this is not impossible. Well, how can this happen? All right, in 2020, Biden received 306 Electoral College votes. He won enough states to get that number. Remember, 270 is the magic number. Donald Trump had 232, so that's a little bit of a cushion. If in 2024, however, Trump wins back, kind of see there, I guess we can divide the swing states into 2 categories, really. You've got the northern tier, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, the so-called blue wall, Midwest. Then you've got the southern states, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and then it's not in tan on this map, but North Carolina is usually been very close in recent elections, even though they tend to go Republican. All right. Anyway, if Trump should come back and win that southern tier, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina, but lose the northern tier, and by the way, the polls suggest it is not unlikely. In fact, right now, Harris is ahead in the northern 3, but not necessarily. She's behind Arizona and Georgia, very close to North Carolina and Nevada. So it could turn out that way. If it does, though, let's think about this. So that the number of Electoral College votes there would bump it down, cross off those 4 states. You go from 306 down to 273. Now, it seems like that would still be a little bit of a cushion, right? 270 is the magic number. Something has intervened between 2020 and 2024, and that is the 2020 census. So we had some shifting around because of the population movement in the country. New York, Pennsylvania, California, Illinois, and Michigan, all Democratic states, lost a seat as a result of the census. Oregon and Colorado, also Democratic states, gained 2 seats. So Democrats went down, 5, came back 2, so that's a net loss of 3. So that 273 with a little cushion has now become 270. If you're following me on that. So now 1 Electoral College vote matters. Where on earth can we find 1 Electoral College vote? So as you all know, the blue dot district of Omaha, district number 2 of Nebraska, has been getting a lot of attention, and for good reason, because if Harris loses Nebraska 2, even if she continued, has had 1 Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, she loses Nebraska 2, or if the state legislature had decided in Nebraska that we needed to do away with our winner-take-all system, that would bump it down to a 269 to 269 tie if there had been no blue dot. What happens then? All right, you might know this from the Constitution, but the Senate picks the VP from among the two candidates who received the most popular votes. So presumably either Tim Walz or J.D. Vance would be the president, depending on which party controls the Senate. In the House, they picked from the top three candidates. Don't ask me why the founders decided to go with three and not two, but that's what they did. So if they deadlocked, maybe RFK Jr. could come back and be the compromise candidate of people who are fond of putting dead mammals in Central Park. That appeals to people about RFK Jr. Which Congress though? Now remember, all this is happening before we swear in the next Congress. So would it be the current Congress or the incoming Congress? It actually is the incoming. We number our Congresses. We're in the 118th right now. It would be the 119th that would make this decision. So we don't know which way it's going to go. You know, I hope you're paying attention to the congressional races and senatorial races. And you focus on the presidency, but you know, what's happening in Congress is going to be crucial. The Democrats have a very small majority in the Senate. The Republicans have a very small majority in the House. There is a strong possibility that that's going to reverse in the 2024 election. Republicans in the House are defending a lot of seats that were won by Joe Biden, so it means they've got some affinity for Democratic candidates. So it easily could be that the Democrats can pick up the 5 seats that they need to become the majority in the 119th Congress. So let's suppose that happens. If that happens and the Democrats have the majority in the House, that means they'd be able to select Kamala Harris, right? No. In a final stop to the small states, the founders said this election, the selection in the House for the president will be on the basis of state delegations. In other words, California gets 1 vote, Nebraska gets 1 vote. So right now, the Republicans have a majority in 26 states. So their delegation has more Republicans than Democrats. The Democrats have a majority in 22, and there are 2 tied delegations, Minnesota and Virginia. I say this is unlikely to change. I mean, things will change some, but there's almost no way that the Democrats are going to have more state delegations that they control than House, than the Republicans. So what this means is if it's a 269-269 tie, excuse me, Donald Trump will be president of the United States. All right, the polls. As I say here, aren't they just veiled electioneering to help favored candidates? I hear this a lot. That's simply not true. The real polls, the ones that are serious, that are not sponsored by the candidates or parties, they want desperately to be accurate. In fact, they're graded on their election accuracy. And in fact, this is the only time they can be graded, and their reputation depends on it. Let me go to the next slide, and this will make more sense to you. So here's something I just pulled out. There are a lot of these that are floating around. But here are a list of polling entities, and they're graded. So what do you see here? Well, you see some media outlets, New York Times, ABC, Washington Post. You see a lot of colleges and universities, Siena, Marquette, Monmouth, Marist, Suffolk, Emerson. But then you also see some private for-profit entities, YouGov, Muhlenberg, Seltzer, Mason-Dixon, Gallup. So these are, and the accuracy, that's just what you think. This is how close they come. For some reason, the way this is set up, a larger negative number means you're more accurate. So you want to be number 1 here. You want to get 3 stars. Transparency is making sure that people can find out how you conducted your poll. What I think is interesting is accuracy evaluation can only come in elections. There's no other type of poll that has an answer key. I'm going to mention in a second that I do a lot of work with YouGov. So I've commissioned, maybe 8 polls with them. So they like me and they take me out to dinner sometimes. I just want to chat with them. I say, what are you doing right now? And usually the answer is, oh, well, we're surveying 20 to 30-year-old males, and we present 3 jingles and they tell us which one they like the best. And then Coors Light is going to use, whatever they find out. Well, okay, so they do that. And they tell Coors, here's the jingle that works best. You don't really know if that's true. They'll use that presumably, and they'll sell some beer or not sell some beer, but you don't know if the other ones would have done better. The only time polling is evaluated is with an election. There is a correct answer. how close did you come? So all their evaluation comes in elections. And the higher they rank on this, the more business they're gonna get. YouGov wants to be right, because then they're gonna get more companies like Coors Light that ask them to do their survey. So I think the notion of polls are just trying to, just get a candidate they prefer to, and name that individual the winner. That's not true. They want to be right. And they're going to be evaluated on their election performance. However, this does not mean they're accurate. They want to be accurate, but that doesn't mean they're going to be. It's a really tough thing to do these days. Polling came of age in the period of one landline per family. This was great, because you could do random digit dialing and get a pretty good representation. Almost all families had a phone, usually just one phone. The real polling agencies then, they would call a number, and then they'd say, how many voting age individuals live in this household? And then they'd randomly select one of those individuals, and then they had to talk to that individual. So they didn't want to, make it so that the person who tends to talk more on the phone was giving the answers, because that individual may not be representative. So they did a lot of work, but it was made easier by the landlines and by the fact that every family pretty much had a phone. Now we've got cell phones, caller ID. What are you going to do? Some organizations try to get cell phone lists of cell phones that people are going to talk to them and take other heroic steps. A lot of organizations use massive online panels. In fact, that's what YouGov does, so I know a little bit about that. I know this a chart here. It's difficult to read. There's really only three things you might notice. First, here's 2000, and you can see that, and then here's 2022. The number of polling agencies has gone up dramatically. This blue area, people who use, or polling organizations that use random digit dialing and telephone. You can see how big it was. And now by 2022, though, there's almost nobody that does that. What's taken its place is this yellowish kind of thing there. And those are these online panels. YouGov, again, I just talk about them because I know about them. They have between 1 and 2 million people that participate, and they've asked them, would you be part of our panel? They work very hard to cultivate this panel, and then individuals will participate in surveys, and it's kind of like little green stamps or something. You get some little credits, and you get enough credit, you can cash that in for something useful. So these are really, some people think of them as professional survey respondents. YouGov gets around that by having, again, between 1 and 2 million. So you're not going to be doing a lot of these things. Still, it's not the way we'd like to do it. We'd much rather have a random process than have to rely on these things. So then what happens is, when I go to YouGov, I say I want a, representative sample of voting age members of the American public. When Coors Light does it, whatever demographic they think buys a lot of beer, 20 to 30-year-old males. So then YouGov constructs that from their panel, and people fill it out online. And again, not ideal, but that's the way a lot of surveys are done. I hear so many people say, the polls can't be right because I've never been called. Well, a couple of reasons for that. These samples are really quite small, and now a lot of people aren't calling anymore. They're using these online panels instead. So the simple truth is, especially in the modern era, getting an accurate assessment of the views of 300 million people, a sample of 1,500 is extremely challenging. You just have to recognize that. Say what you will about Nate Silver. One of the good things he did was to popularize this notion of using poll of polls. In other words, look at a lot of polls and average them together. Any single poll is subject to a lot of bias. You can minimize that bias by averaging together a lot of polls. That's what a lot of people have done. This one's a little bit dated, still had Kennedy in it. But it shows a kind of steadiness that you won't see if you look at individual polls that will be bouncing all over. I think the polls are probably right now that Harris has a lead, but a small one. Look for polls and recognize that the sampling error is real. You can't get rid of it. It doesn't mean that polls have done something wrong. Anytime you try to represent the views of 200 or 300 million people with a sample of 1,500, you're going to have sampling error. So take that seriously. If we say that the poll of polls suggests that Harris has 50% support, Trump has 47, and sampling error is 3 plus or minus 3, that means we really don't know. And that's hard for people to recognize, and they think that means polls are flawed, but that's not necessarily the case. It's too bad. We're such a closely divided country right now, but exactly what we want to know is what polls can't tell us, because it's just so close. And then you've got the state-by-state component, which makes it even worse. It really doesn't matter. Harris could be ahead by a couple, 3 points, and she could easily lose the race depending on how things are distributed across states, especially in those swing states. One of the hard things for polling is to identify who's gonna vote and who isn't. It's something people like to fib about. You know, we all like to be socially acceptable. So if some stranger comes up to you and says you're gonna vote, you say, well, sure. And then, you know, you might or you might not. The reason polling organizations tend to come to different answers is due to a lot of things, but mostly they're different metrics, they're different procedures for trying to identify who's really gonna go to the polls. Because those are the ones they'd like to ask. Well, weren't the polls really off in recent years? In 2016, they weren't off that much. This is a common misconception. The final poll of polls had Clinton winning by about 3%. She won by 2%. Remember, she did win the popular vote quite comfortably. So that means the polls overshot Trump's support by about a point. That's not bad. In fact, if you look at history, it's better than they usually do. They were often in the states. Several state polls were off, which is not surprising. State polls tend not to be very professional. There aren't as many of them. And so in those key states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, the state polls overestimated her support pretty dramatically. And that was, I think that's the source of this sense that the polls were way off. National pollsters are trying to correct that now, recognizing how the system works. The national pollsters are doing special polls in the swing states, not just the national poll. So that, you know, can give us a little bit more confidence, I think. What about 2020? Well, they did pretty badly in 2020. You can't gainsay that. The final poll of polls had Biden ahead by about 8 points, and he actually won by about 4. That's a pretty big goof. 51.3 to 46.9 was the final result. So the people, especially Democrats, are a little bit concerned that we see a pattern here in the last couple of elections of under-predicting Republican support or support for Donald Trump. Why might this be? A lot of theories. It seems as though some Trump supporters just are suspicious of surveys and polls and won't participate in them. And of course, if they absent themselves from the survey, you're not going to get that component, which then comes into play in the election, and you're going to be off. A lot of evidence now that pollsters inadvertently undersampled people without college degrees, both 2016, but especially in 2020. This is important because people without college degrees broke heavily for Donald Trump. So if you're off in that fashion, then it's going to be, you're going to have the kind of bias that we had. Also, there's some evidence that late deciders broke for Trump in 2020. What will 2024 bring about? We don't know. The polls were quite accurate in 2022, in the midterms, that is. In fact, if anything, they overestimated Republican support. Remember, a lot of people said there was going to be that red wave in 2022, which never materialized. So they did quite well in 2022. Some people think they've corrected. Some people, maybe this is Democrat wishful thinking, that they might have overcorrected for the, including uneducated, non-college educated individuals in the sample. We'll just have to see. But it is the case that there's nothing God-given about this bias toward Republicans in the polls. That is, bias against Republicans, I guess. So there you can see in 2020, we had that large, almost 4-point bias, overshot support for Democrats, much more modest overshooting in 2016. In 2012, however, we see that the Republicans were said to have more support than they really did. The polls overshot Republican support, and in 2000 they did that as well by 2.6 points. 2008, 2004, they're very close. So we just don't know. In the last couple of elections, yes, it's been the Republicans who have done better than the polls suggested, but that isn't always the case. All right, polarization. If you need any evidence that we're polarized, I think this might help. In 1980, 27% of Democrats voted for the winning Republican candidate, Ronald Reagan. That's better than 1 out of 5 that crossed over and voted for Reagan. In 2000, 11% of Democrats voted for George W. Bush. In 2020, only 6% of Republicans voted for the winning Democratic candidate, crossed over. So you can see a trend here. It's just we don't have a lot of people who cross the aisles and vote anymore. And then, of course, in 2020, we had a controversial Republican candidate in Donald Trump. So you might have expected a little bit more of that. You've probably heard about this famous result. The question and surveys was, would you be displeased if your child married someone from the other political party? Well, in 1960, you'd see almost nobody said yes, we'd be displeased. Back then, people would be displeased if they crossed racial lines, perhaps, or religious lines, but nobody thought about political parties. 2010, half of Republicans said they'd be displeased if their child married a Democrat, and a third of Democrats said they'd be displeased if their child married a Republican. And that's 2010. You know, sorry, I tried to, I know I've seen this more recently, but I couldn't find it, but I'm sure that's gone up a lot. I hang around a lot of Democrats and they would be crestfallen if their child married. So I know that 33 is a lot lower. So we are polarized. Why are we? Well, a lot of people immediately point to changes in the media, and it is true that we can, focus on things that please us and screen out things that go against us. I don't want to put that down, but I do think that's more of a reinforcing effect. I think there's something bigger going on. Pam was nice enough to mention my most recent book, so this is the self-serving slide of the presentation. This is a book I wrote to try to explain why Trump's base, not why, what they really wanted. So, it makes a wonderful stocking stuffer. Party favor, I think if your grandchild has a birthday, I really put this book in. Kids love it. Others have told me that it makes a wonderful doorstop, a paperweight. Actually, the great thing about being retired and not planning to write another book is that I don't need to worry about sales, so I don't care. If you're curious about what motivates Trump supporters, you might want to take a look, but you don't need to buy this book. But I do want to use the next couple of slides to tell you why I think we are so polarized. And a lot of people disagree with me on this, and you're certainly welcome to do that. But here's my pitch. A few of you have heard this in an Ollie class or other talks I've given, so I'll go fairly fast. What I think is helpful is to kind of distinguish strong Trump supporters from other conservatives. So the way I did this, I asked YouGov, this was a survey that they did for me in 2019, a representative sample of America. And one of the questions was, do you think Donald Trump is one of the greatest presidents ever? And so a lot of people say yes, but a lot of people, even conservatives, also say no. I'm going to vote for him, I support him, but the notion that he's right up there with Abe Lincoln and George Washington, that's crazy. So the NTVC, sorry for the initials, is non-Trump venerating conservatives. And I'm going to compare them to what I call Trump venerators. So people who said, yes, Donald Trump, greatest thing ever. And what I think is interesting here is I'm going to put up some of their stances on social and economic issues. Things like lower taxes for all, abortion rights, and a lot of numbers, but just move over to the right side. That compares the two, how close they are. And you can see those are pretty small numbers. So in other words, these Trump venerators and the other conservatives who don't venerate Trump, they're not that much different when it comes to lower taxes, abortion rights, kind of interesting. But the Trump venerators are actually a little bit more supportive of abortion rights, so that'd be a slightly more liberal position. But again, the numbers are small, just 2, 3, 4, 5 points. Now compare this with what I call securitarian issues. These are issues, well, I think you'll understand what they are. They're about security, gun rights. So there you see the Trump venerators are 17 points more supportive of gun rights than other conservatives, not of them compared to liberals, compared to conservatives. Death penalty, 18% more supportive. Reducing immigration, also 18%. Increasing defense spending, 26%. So now we're getting into some big numbers. For those of you who care about some things, the top battery differences are not statistically significant. A lot of ones they are. So this to me is where Trump supporters, Trump venerators, the Trump's base really lives on these issues like gun rights, immigration. To me, what they want to do is protect themselves and the core of America, what they see as a historical, traditional core, English-speaking, white, straight, Christian America. This to them is what it's all about, and they think it's under attack. They feel this strongly in ways that maybe, I'm guessing a lot of you can't appreciate. It's just different, orientation. But this is where I think the real difference lies. Here's another way of looking at it. I asked the Trump venerators to list, I think I gave them like 25 possible issues. Tell me the thing that you think is most important, second most, third most, and fourth most. Here's what they had. Immigration, number 1, national defense, gun rights, law and order. You see a real pattern there, I think. Let's go all the way over to liberals. There's people who self-identified as a liberal. You can see how different America is. For them, the number 1 issue was racial justice. Number 2, healthcare. Number 3, women's rights. Number 4, income inequality. So to me, you've got the one side that wants to protect this inner core, and the other that really is worried about what that inner core might do to other individuals, to people who are not part of that core, to women, to other races, to immigrants, to people who are down and out, maybe economically. So that, I think, to me, is what really is at the base of all this. uses the sign. It's not immigration, it's an invasion. And that's really the way it feels to a lot of Trump venerators. Trump's base wants to protect the historical insiders, the core of American society, because they believe that threats are being posed by outsiders. On the other side, the Trump's strongest opponents, these are the individuals who want to protect societal outsiders. You know, they're worried about these outsiders and what the insiders can do for them. Big business or others that might abuse the rights of these so-called outsiders. And outsiders don't mean immigrants necessarily, just people who haven't been part of that central element of the United States. You see this in country after country. You know, whether it's Modi in India and Hindu nationalism, the guy in the center and upper middle there is Nigel Farage talking about Brexit, Giorgia Meloni in Italy trying to keep out immigrants from Africa. You get the idea, and Donald Trump in the United States. It amazes me the similarity of this group of individuals, these leaders. They're really cut from very similar cloth in terms of their attitude toward crime, race, and immigration, and religion. And I think that to me says something about what is universal. And you see this through American history, the Civil War on the upper left, the 1960s, when a lot of you were probably long-haired hippie radicals, you know, challenging authority, challenging the core of America. And mainstream America found that very disconcerting. And then today, you have individuals in the lower right who believe that they're standing up for the core of America and protecting it from what's going to happen if these outsiders get the upper hand. Lots of right-wing parties around the world support the welfare state and abortion rights. What we have in the United States is not universal. And if you look at Europe, there are a lot of right-wing parties that are supporting big welfare and also abortion rights. And let me give you an example of that. A few years ago, I was on a lecture tour in Denmark. And I was talking about this universality of the left-right dimension, and you know, Danes are very polite. So after one of these talks, I was confronted by 2 or 3 of them, and they said, "Well, we didn't want to, take you on in the question and answer. Didn't want to embarrass you, but you got this all wrong. There is no universal left-right." And then they told me all about this. You know how in Denmark the right-wing parties are very supportive of the national healthcare system that they have, and big taxes. You know that's not in dispute. And then, fortunately, this is one of the times I thought quickly on my feet. I usually don't. I said, "Well, okay, but what do those right-wing parties think about extending the social safety system to recent immigrants?" They said, "Well, no, of course, then, they don't like that at all." I said, "Well, now you're talking. This is where the real division comes between the left and the right. Not necessarily, I'm not saying abortion or healthcare are unimportant, but if you look for what's universal in dividing people, I really think you need to go back to these issues of in-group, out-group, because I see this, it's been like that forever. I had a couple more slides on this, but I know I was going to be running short of time. But so, there is evidence throughout history that you see this kind of division between new ways of thinking about society. Should we move away from hunter-gatherer into more agricultural? Should we change the role of women? Should we move away from warfare? That's just been going on forever. How to relate to non-traditional lifestyles. Worrying about the tribe over the hill. Should we welcome them into our midst? There was a lot of movement among tribes, by the way. How are we going to approach that? Or do we keep them at arm's length? So that, to me, is why we're so polarized today, is because the issues we talk about are the ones that are evolutionarily central. If we could shift and somehow talk about just infrastructure and capital gains taxes, I think things would be better. Although now even those issues have been kind of permeated by this division that we see between the central issues. Just a couple slides on democracy, and then I'll be quiet. Is democracy in danger? I think yes, it is. I think it's good to think about it that way, even if it isn't, and I think it is. So on a variety of fronts, I think we need to recognize this. One of the questions I asked in my survey, if given a choice between security and democracy, security would be the way to go. In 2019, 42% of Americans said that's true. So I know security is important, but still, without democracy, we don't really have much of anything. Now, not surprisingly, Trump supporters were much more likely to say that's true. I think about 2/3 of Trump supporters said that. But about 25% of liberals said this as well, that if the trade-offs between security and democracy, I'm going with security. I think that's a little bit concerning. Understandable, perhaps, but concerning. And the last survey question I'll mention is, this was a complicated one, but bear with me on this.
this. It read as follows: imagine a politician who is enacting policies that you believed with all your heart to be deeply wrong and harmful to the country. How far would you go to promote change or to register your dissatisfaction? And I'll give you the percent of Americans who said they would.
A whole bunch of things here, like removing a yard sign or heckling a politician, not eating at the restaurant. But the one I thought I'd mention was purposely misplace a box of valid ballots. How many would do that? Well, 12% said yes. I don't know how that strikes you. It's not a big number. On the other hand, we're talking about 1 out of 8 Americans who said they would cheat. They would take this box of ballots. And here again, I think this is probably an underestimate, don't you? And remember, this is 2019, so I think after 2020 and all that happened there, I think that would have gone up. Plus, we know, again, socially acceptable people would be a little bit reluctant to admit they would. And think about it yourselves. You know, I know a lot of you have some strong feelings. If this box of ballots would keep Donald Trump from getting in the White House, or if you're on the other side, would keep Kamala Harris from getting in the White House, what would you do? Nobody's going to catch you. Would you do that? I mean, that's a powerful force. We feel strongly about these things, but I think we need to say yes. We would submit that box of ballots. You know, we have to have that attitude toward democracy. Don't be one of those people. Now, one final sidelight here, which I think is kind of interesting. I hope you know a little bit about this. We wouldn't have an opportunity to do this, would we really? Well, probably not. But you know, we do have a feature of Nebraska that's quite unique. I hope you've been hearing about this. According to a 1914 law, Nebraska counties can draft election workers just like they do people in juries. No other state does this. Only one county, Douglas County, does this. I mean, every county could, but only one has been doing it. Osarpy has started just a little bit, but mostly it's just Douglas. And they get about half of their election workers from this recruitment process. So you get a thing in the mail. They talked about one person who went to his boss. The boss said, "No, you can't do this." And he said, "Well, I have to. You know, I'm going to be recruited." And the boss checked it out and said, "Yeah, we've got to let this person off to do this." It's really quite a good system. You've got to be a registered voter. They carefully balance Democrats and Republicans. And all those who come away from this process are very supportive of the process. I think it really would help us. If everybody could see what was going on, how the sausage was being made, they would feel better about it. It broadens the pool, boosts confidence. It's really a great idea. But of course, even those people who are drafted in are not going to have a chance to, you know, take away a box of ballots. One of the things that gives them confidence is that every step of the process, we have a Democrat and a Republican involved. So you're just not going to have this opportunity. So it's more conceptual. I would like people to think to themselves that they would respect the process. They would treat that box of ballots, even if it's going to do great damage to the country in your mind, the way it should be treated. So last slide. Everyone needs to commit to democracy because it's vulnerable. Democracy is a very difficult thing to love. You know, it really gives your opponents, people who you think are just flat out dead wrong, voice and influence. But you know, it also guarantees that you have some voice and influence. So in that sense, even when we lose, and I say here perhaps especially when we lose, it is essential that we commit to democracy. And that's my parting shot. Thank you very much.
You know what? I've gotten probably more texts and emails and phone calls and everything that I've ever reached about elections. And one of the things that they go off and say, you know, are you going to vote? Yes, you know, who are you going to vote for, whatever. But you can't get out of it. You can't really give them information without giving them money. And so that's where is this like an actual poll, or is this from the party, or you know, I mean, after a while you get kind of suspicious because it's happening so often. You know, if you're a giver, that's great, but if all of a sudden they're asking you 2 times a day, you're like, ooh.
Yeah, it is a problem. There's so many different entities that you end up, if there was a centralized process, which maybe I would encourage you to do, you know, if you can just go straight to the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, whichever you prefer, Act Blue or whatever they're called. You know, you might want to do that as opposed to picking out individual candidates, unless you have strong feelings about that. But it's part of our problem with having, you know, an election for president and 100 senators and all these representatives, and then you got the local races. And then you've got the ballot measures and things like that. So we do have a lot of things going on that, in a lot of countries, they vote for a member of the legislature. And then, of course, the legislature is going to select who the executive is. They don't have ballot measures. So our ballot is a lot more complicated than a lot of places. That means we have a lot of races, a lot of opportunities for money. And yeah, it does get kind of tiresome. I understand exactly.
John, I'm gonna need you to repeat their questions
Repeat the questions.
for the people on Zoom.
Ballot boxes. I often wonder why when you send or sick, somebody can just steal the ballot box. January. Because it's sitting there on the desk, and there are all these roses in there. One could have brought up the ballot box, and then
So the question is about, I guess not really the ballot box so much as on January 6th, when Congress was involved with certifying the election, then they had a box of all the electoral college votes. And the question is, why didn't one of the people who invaded Congress that day take the box? And I guess there was some of that going on. So they were thinking along your lines, Bob. The question is, however things turn out, how do we get people to get along and to live together and recognize that, the other side is human as well? I don't have a great answer for you. I think that's more of a, I don't know, sociological, psychological thing. I certainly agree with your sentiment. We need to do that. I always like to say that I spent the first 20 years of my career trying to get my students to care more about American politics, and the last 20 trying to get them to care a little bit less. I'm being flipped there. I didn't really want them to care less, but I think you know what I mean. Some of them were wound a little tight and cared so much that they couldn't view the people on the other side as human beings. And so I worked a little bit to try to bring that out. I think we have to recognize that there are some reasons, there's some opportunities for honest disagreements about about policy. What should the immigration rate be into the United States? That's a legitimate issue. So I think if we can just focus on that, these valid differences, that's the way it's supposed to be, instead of character assassination. Hopefully it could be a little bit better. I think people want to ruin the country. There's so much overstatement on each side. Yes.
it's never going to be possible to get money out of politics.
Question is it ever going to be possible to get money out of politics? I think that would be extremely difficult given the way the United States system is set up, given the court's view that money is speech, really, that, at one point we had a system in the United States for public financing of presidential elections. Remember that? But then the court really weakened that so much that it didn't make much sense. You could check it off on your taxes, have a few dollars go here and there. But yeah, the court basically has ruled that it would be, if you're a rich person, you get to spend the money however you want. So to put a restriction on that is a violation of freedom of expression, freedom of speech. So I guess I have to be a pessimist on that. I just think to be realistic, I don't see how it can happen unless the court would really change its view of what money is in the United States. Yeah.
There's increasing, I think, media attention and everything from books to magazines, whatever, on Christian nationalism. And they're that forward for the election and not
You really want to get me in trouble, don't you? The question is on Christian nationalism. Well, let me do it this way. I think Donald Trump is a very interesting aspect of that. So a lot of strong Christians revere Donald Trump, but yet there's some evidence that maybe I don't think from a doctrinal point of view, Trump is much of a Christian. You know, he doesn't know, well, you know, he doesn't go to church a lot, and, you know, he just doesn't exude that. But what he does do is value Christianity as part of this inner core of America, I think, and that's what really resonates with a lot of people. It's the same with the military, in my opinion, you know. A lot of Trump supporters have been in the military, but they revere the military. They're the first ones who want to say, you know, we honor your service and things like that. And I think it's because, I don't think they're being hypocritical necessarily, it's just saying this is what is important to us. So Christianity, they like the idea of Christianity as a concept. And I think that's, in my opinion, that's what Donald Trump, that's his attitude, more than the fact that he's, you know, doctrinally religious. That doesn't really answer your question, but I think to answer your question, I get into bigger trouble than I thought we already did. So the question is kind of a strategic question. What's the best way for campaigns to go about broadening their base and getting, you know, activating voters and things like that? You know, I guess I trust the opinions of the people involved in campaigns. You know, they must be doing what they think works, which is, I think, a little bit of everything. Probably social media, of course, is really involved this year. There's a lot of focus on young people, you know, and interesting divisions these days between the attitudes of young women and young men. Well, women and men generally have a bigger gender split, but young people pose an interesting problem for campaigners to get first-time voters out. So there you see, I mean, Kamala Harris is focused on kind of novel media approaches, things like that. And then they're doing some of the old school stuff, you know, wall to wall, you know, or door to door, get out the vote kinds of things. So I suppose my answer would be a little bit of everything. You used to hear a lot about retail campaigning. You know, that becomes more and more difficult in such a large society. So I think you've got to do some wholesale stuff as well. That's, I think, what the campaigns are doing. Yeah, I can't see.
About only allow the candidates to advertise or campaign for a month. Do you ever see that happening here?
So the question is, could we shorten campaigns? Like Canada only goes for a month. The UK, a lot of times they'll announce an election and then 3 weeks later they have it. I think, oh, that's brilliant. I think that would be a big improvement over that. So much is redundant. Do I see it happening in the United States? Probably not. You know, I think we're locked in. You know, that would go back to the money question, really, in a way. You know, I think that's a lot of the reason we have such an expensive campaign, is it goes on forever. So I think that's a great idea. I think it's probably unlikely to happen in the United States.
One final question?
I've got a question here from Zoom. Because the undereducated make up such a large part of Trump's base, do you feel that the nation's K-12 schools are failing in areas such as civics and history?
So I guess the implication of that is if the schools aren't turning out Democrats, they're failing. You know, as an educator, I think, you know, I tried to be pretty balanced about things, and I think my students generally came away from my classes thinking that I hadn't been, you know, putting my finger too heavily on the scale one way or the other. I taught a class on the 2020 elections, right during the election, and we had 25 students in that, so it was upper level class. And I probably had 6 or 7 really strong Trump supporters in that. And we got along quite well until the election. And then when Trump was challenging the results, that's when things went south, really. And then the class, including me, I think we had a problem with the Trump supporters. So I think to me, that's what it's all about. We can dispute policies and talk about how to run an election, but then once the election is decided, I think we need to respect the result. We got to respect the process. We have to respect democracy. And so, I think that's what K through 12 and beyond K through 12 need to teach for sure. A lot of the rest of it is up to students. We can't teach them to have certain policy views, but we can teach them to respect democracy. And that's not an easy thing to do. But I think that's what needs to be done. And if K through 12 and beyond K through 12 are not doing that, then yeah, I think we need to think about some changes. But it goes far beyond just teaching them, facts about what happened in 1776. There's a whole attitude, this committing to democracy that I referred to. And I think we might need to be able to think harder about what curriculum would look like that would do that. And I don't think it's partisan, because they would appear partisan. Kind of sad. But I think that to me is what K through 12 needs to do. Thank you.